Welcome back to our discussion of Renaissance art. Today we will be discussing 16th century painting in Italy. This is the time period that we call the High Renaissance or the Cinquecento. The Cinquecento refers to the 1500s or the 16th century in Italy. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. In the 15th century, we will hear about those famous Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You're right, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. We also talk about Donatello, but he's really working more in the late 15th century. What do we see in the High Renaissance? Well, first of all, we're going to see a great deal of development in the field of portraiture. So let's look at this iconic painting. Everyone knows it, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, also called La Gioconda. This is dated to about 1503, 1505, and this is a painting done in oil on wood. Why is this painting so famous? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One being that the painting was actually stolen in the sort of modern era. It was actually stolen from the Louvre by an Italian employee of the Louvre who believed that since it was done by an Italian painter, that it somehow belonged in Italy. So he actually stole the painting, tried to sell it to the Uffizi galleries in Florence. They said, by the way, we can't buy stolen art, and it was returned to the Louvre in Paris, where it was welcomed with all of this fanfare. So there was a lot of news about this painting being stolen, which helped make this painting sort of more famous. This painting is also famous because it traveled from Europe to the United States and was shown for a short period of time at the Met in New York City. And people lined up around the block for this. So this is one of the first kind of blockbuster art exhibitions where people flocked to this place just to see this one painting. So this helped increase the fame of this one particular painting by Leonardo da Vinci. Another thing that sort of helps make it famous is that we don't actually know exactly who this woman is. We think it might be the wife of a man called Giocondo, so this is why we call her La Gioconda. Perhaps this is his wife, a kind of a wealthy Italian merchant. But beyond that, we don't know that much about this painting. So I think all of these things together have kind of helped to make this a famous painting. We also see Leonardo da Vinci's characteristic style with the soft blending, the very subtle shadows, and this kind of freshness and warmth of color. We also see a sort of typical triangular composition. This sort of becomes the go-to positioning for portraiture from the Renaissance on. You'll also see behind La Gioconda this kind of Italianate landscape. This also becomes very typical. And in fact, artists like Albrecht Dürer, when doing his self-portraits, he's a German artist, but he travels to Italy and he sees the way that Italians are doing this portraiture and he brings this back into his style. So he does some of his self-portraits dressed up as an aristocrat with the landscape behind him in this kind of Italianate style. And in fact, if you like Albrecht Dürer, I'm a super fan. I will be doing a video soon about Albrecht Dürer, so subscribe for more videos. Let's get back to Leonardo da Vinci's The Mona Lisa or La Gioconda. Another thing that we see is her very interesting gaze. She is sort of staring out to the viewer. So you get the impression as you're looking at this painting that it's looking back at you. This was sort of a bold gaze for women at the time in the Renaissance. If you compare it to an earlier portrait, let's say Piero della Francesca's portrait of Battista Sforza, we see in this 1400s version that the woman is looking off to the side, that we see her in profile, and we don't get this direct gaze. When we look at Leonardo da Vinci's La Gioconda in the early 16th century, we have a very direct gaze. And this does become the norm in the Renaissance and going forward for portraiture. So Leonardo da Vinci is sort of setting the stage for what future artists will do. Now, let's travel to Rome because we see a lot of high Renaissance art in the 16th century or the 1500s in Rome. And the artwork that you've almost definitely heard of before is Michelangelo's painting on the interior of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo is working in Florence. He considers himself a sculptor, really, and Pope Julius II asks him to come to Rome, to come to the Vatican and paint the ceiling of his personal chapel, which we now call the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo at first rejects the idea. He really doesn't want to come to Rome and do this. And he even says, I'm not really a painter, I'm more of a sculptor. And they're sort of going back and forth. And eventually, Michelangelo is perhaps sort of coerced by the Pope, who threatens him with excommunication if he doesn't comply. Michelangelo eventually comes to Rome to paint this fantastic ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. What do we see in terms of the iconography? In the center, in the sort of ceiling above the nave, we see 9 scenes from the book of Genesis. This is the first book of the Bible. And these registers and these scenes are divided into these painted architectural features. So there's a great deal of illusionism. It looks like there are these statues and these marble elements, but really all of this is painted by Michelangelo and, of course, his assistants. He had to have a team of assistants to help work on this project. Here we're looking at a detail. This is a very iconic image in art history. This is Michelangelo's creation of Adam, and we see God dressed in this soft pink robe with this gray beard, reaching out and sort of breathing life into Adam, giving him life. Adam, who is sort of laying out on the earth, and sort of God surrounded by angels is kind of, floating around in the sky. Here we can see Michelangelo's interest in anatomy. He has really mastered depicting the human anatomy, and you almost get the sense that, yeah, Michelangelo really is a sculptor, because these painted figures almost look like paintings of classical Roman sculptures. You can see that Michelangelo has really mastered the details of the human form, depicting the bones, the musculature. It's really kind of an ode to the beauty of the human body. Michelangelo also depicts the fall of man, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden. And I think this is nice to look at next to Masaccio's depiction of the same subject matter. Again, you can see the monumentality of Michelangelo's figures and almost the sculptural quality. You get a sense of the mass of these bodies in Michelangelo's. Adam and Eve, who are, crouching and turning away in shame as they're being kicked out of the garden by the angel who's pretty intensely got that sword at Adam's throat. It's pretty intense. This painting, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, is a fresco. Remember, a fresco is when paint or pigment, which is suspended in water. So the pigment is something that's ground up to a powder, mixed with water, and then this is painted onto the wet plaster and fuses with the plaster as it hardens, becoming part of the wall. If you look at a detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you can almost get a sense of where the plaster was laid and like sort of how much work could be done in a day. You can see a little bit of a sort of halo or line around the head and the arm of this figure, so you can see sort of a day's work. And then the color and the plaster would have to be mixed fresh every day. When you look at Michelangelo's ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you can see a style that is very sort of linear in quality, whereas Leonardo da Vinci is using sfumato to blur the edges of his figures. Michelangelo's figures almost appear to have a dark outline. We see that this linear quality, the sketch or the drawing, is important to Michelangelo in his painting. And so we have really visible elements of sort of the sculptural quality of the human form and the linear quality almost outlining these figures in Michelangelo's painting. Now, just down the hall from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, we can see Raphael's School of Athens. This was painted in Rome. It's in the Vatican. We have the same patron, Pope Julius II, who commissions Raphael to paint this image, sometimes called Philosophy, other times called the School of Athens, in the Stanza della Segnatura. It's kind of an office space for the Pope. And this is, again, a fresco on the wall of this building. Raphael's School of Athens is really the ideal high Renaissance Italian painting. First of all, we have classical subject matter. What we see are ancient philosophers gathered together, and they're, sitting around philosophizing. They're rationalizing, they're talking about mathematics, philosophy, the nature of existence, etc. And you can go through and identify each and every one of these philosophers. They are recognizable through their attributes. So, for example, Euclid, the geometrician, is bending over a compass in the right foreground. How else is this typical of the high Renaissance in Italy? Well, in addition to the classical subject matter, we also have a classical environment. This big rounded arch, this linear perspective that creates this illusion of depth on the flat surface, and then these kind of vaguely classical statues that are painted into this classical environment. We have a very symmetrical composition. Imagine drawing a line right down the center. We have a very symmetrical composition that helps to create this sense of balance and calm. And these are very much Renaissance ideals, balance and calm. We also have a naturalistic depiction of the human figures. There's a variety of human postures. They're standing in different angles, some of them twisting, seated, pointing, reaching. And we have a naturalistic depiction of their clothing, the sort of folds in the robe. You can see the use of chiaroscuro, light and dark, to shape and model the forms to create a sense of naturalism in the robes, in the setting. You can see the figures are casting shadows. You can see that Raphael has really mastered linear perspective. So all of this comes together to create this very ideal high Renaissance painting. You also have smack dab in the center Plato and Aristotle. And if you want to, you can take the time to go through and review all of these different philosophers, mathematicians, etc., who are depicted in this painting. If you look very closely on the right side in the group near sort of Euclid, back in the corner, you have an actual possible self-portrait of Raphael. I mean, we're pretty sure that this is him depicted in this scene. So Raphael has painted himself into the painting. This is kind of different from what we see with some patrons who want themselves painted into the artwork. In this case, the artist himself has painted himself into the painting, trying to elevate his status through his artwork. So in much of the work of Raphael, we really see the ideals of the high Renaissance in Italy. You can look at some of his Madonna and child paintings. Again, you see a very humanized holy figure who has been brought down to earth. We see an accurate depiction of the human form, accurate proportions of the human body. We see a naturalistic landscape with the use of atmospheric perspective and this overall kind of soft, idealized image. The world is seen as this ideal or this perfection. This is really what Renaissance artists are striving toward. They're striving for this perfection. To get an idea of how the early Renaissance is a little bit different from the high Renaissance, let's look at Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks next to Raphael's Madonna del Prato. So you can see in both cases we have a great deal of naturalism, a great deal of use of chiaroscuro, that light and dark, to shape and model the forms. We see triangular compositions in both paintings, and we see a great deal of attention paid to depicting the naturalistic sort of environment or landscape behind these figures. But when we look at Raphael's painting, we can see really the evolution of Renaissance art, and we can see that Raphael's work really exemplifies high Renaissance art. The figures have come even closer to us in the foreground of the painting. They take up a great deal of space on the picture plane. The figures are the focus of the artwork, and the landscape is sort of in the background. We also have this really sort of pale blonde Madonna, which represents the Italian ideal of beauty in the 16th century. This really isn't what Mary would have looked like, but this is a 16th century ideal that's depicted here. Hopefully this gave you a great introduction to the high Renaissance in Italy. Stay tuned for the next video where I discuss Michelangelo's iconic statue, the David.